Information University of Toronto, and she is the distinguished researcher in information organization here with us. And Lynn has served on the faculty at the University of Toronto since 1990. That's a long time. And she also served as the dean there between 1995 and 2003. I really need to mention all these terrific work you've been doing. She's a member of the Canadian Committee on Cataloging, the IFLA Classification and Indexing Section, the IFLA Working Group on Metadata Scheme, and the ISBD Review Group. And she is also the immediate past president of ALICE. And she's a prolific writer and researcher, scholar. Her research interests are mostly in the area of, we call it information organization or knowledge organization. And today she's giving us this wonderful talk, even though you haven't begun. I know it will be terrific. Let's welcome Lynn.
Thank you very much, Shirley. I asked for the really short version, so I think
more than one sentence.
I think that was sort of a compromise. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I really appreciate you coming out at the end of probably what's been a long day, and the sun is shining, and maybe you're trying to think about frolicking, but there's some nice snacks, so I'll try to create something to go along with the delicious snacks. When I was asked for a title, I sent in from SenseMaking and MemoryMaking a methodological journey, and in true scholarly academic fashion, I had second thoughts about the methodological word. So it's in parentheses, in fact, you'll see why as I go through. And what I'm going to be doing, I actually, last year at this time, presented on a piece of this research that is being funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, for which I'm very grateful. And it is a piece of research that is looking at information organization in a very special way. I might frame it in that way. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of context, because I wouldn't anticipate that even if you were here last year at this time you would remember this. But just a little context with this study. I was intrigued back in 2007 to hear this program that Marilyn Powell did, the Once and Future Past, looking at memory, and looking at memory relative to cognitive impairment and diseases such as Alzheimer's and dementia. And this quote really struck me: memory is lost because we cannot find our way back to it. Now, when all of us are every day in every way creating memories, and we're using all of our senses, and perhaps even our sixth sense of intuition, but in a more pragmatic way, our brains are processing things based on things we see and hear and smell and taste and touch. And the brain, and I'm in no way a neurologist, but there are, of course, various areas of the brain that, for example, deal with our taste, and that deal with our what we hear, and so on. So there are all these various areas for processing stimuli. And this is a schema that shows, obviously in very reductionist terms, what happens. So we get some kind of sensation, some sensory information that goes into our short-term memory, which is then stored in the hippocampus. And as the days go by, we all know about this, that as days go by, we retain some parts of the memory that we can recall if we want to tell somebody a story that, oh, this happened yesterday. We pull it into our short-term memory and tell it. But across time, the brain does its thing, it gets consolidated, put into our long-term memory and the neocortex. And every time we want to recall a longer-term memory, we sort of reverse the process, and the more that we bring that memory back the more we bring that long-term memory back and relive it and recall it, the stronger that it gets. So you might even say that we're laying down some longer-term tracks. And what I was interested in for this study is actually thinking about what happens when these various memories that come through our sensory stimulation, what happens if somehow there is some damage done that might disrupt that pattern of memory. And so in thinking about it, in 2007, put together a grant proposal for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and what I wanted to do was just this, to engage in a qualitative exploratory study that, and because we're in the information discipline, looking at concepts of representation and memory within the framework of information sense-making and recall strategy. So it's situating it within the information behaviors framework to some degree, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. And of course, with specific reference to a population that has not been studied previously, at least not in the information discipline. There are studies looking at websites for people with Alzheimer's dementia in terms of making resources available to them. But in terms of Alzheimer's disease as a point of study for people in the information field, there is very little. Now, because I was interested in how we might stimulate memories, and I was also interested in the whole concept of how might we use surrogates, and for those of you in information organization, the concept of surrogates and surrogation is a very familiar one. We are always in the process of creating structures and systems to provide surrogates for real physical and digital objects for access and retrieval purposes. What I wanted to do was say, well, what if I'm thinking of that concept of representation and surrogates, what role might those play in stimulating memory? So the role of representation in the form of tokens serving as memory cues in sense-making and that memory recall. So the representations or surrogates are stand-ins for people, places, things, and events that someone might tell in a personal story or a personal narrative. Along with Erica Hendry, who is the research assistant on this project, we articulated these 3 research questions. So we wanted to see those who have early stage Alzheimer's disease, AD, how do they, in what ways do they use these tokens to access memories of the life stories that they tell us? In what ways and how well do these tokens influence the kinds of memories that they do recall? And how do the tokens influence the narrative? So they're telling stories. We're going to use tokens to help them to recall these stories. What does that all look like? So we're still doing interviews with participants who are being recruited with the assistance of the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto. These are highly unstructured interviews. It starts off with basically a question to an individual, some sort of a warm-up question, like that might be something like, well, tell me about something you really enjoy doing. And they'll start to speak, and then there are sort of non-intrusive probes to pursue the story. And what we're looking at in these stories, and the stories usually go on for about 45 minutes, no more than an hour, and what we're looking for is instances where someone may say something like, well, I remember when, or they might get particularly enthusiastic or passionate or energized about a particular story. And we take both notes and recordings with their permission, of course, and try to pick out these more highly vivid stories, if you will, or ones that seem to have a particular connection for the individual. And then with their permission, we come back a week, no more than 2 weeks after that. And what we do is we go through their stories and we we create tokens. So for example, if someone were to tell us about traveling to Italy as a child, we might come back with a map of Italy. Or if they talked about getting a blue balloon at a birthday party when they were 10 years old, we might come with a blue balloon, that sort of thing. We are creating the tokens. These are not tokens that the individuals are preparing. And thanks to some really helpful input from Charles Antoine last year, we introduced a wild card. So we would bring back tokens that we anticipated might serve as memory cues. And he had suggested, well, what about if you brought something that they had not talked about, and just to see what sorts of stories they might tell. So that's been an interesting addition to the study, and very much thanks to being able to come here and present on that first part. Then we go back for a second session. We take the same tokens and we add in 2 or 3 new ones and just see what happens. So although it's a little bit more detailed and we've wrapped in a little bit more nuance and sophistication in the way that we're assembling our findings. Basically, this has been the pattern of what has occurred so far. So we have the tokens, we hear the first story, we come back with the tokens, and they're spread out on the table, and to say to the individual, well, we've brought some things here that we'd like you to have a look at. Is there anything that particularly strikes you? And the individual, if it's a physical item or object, they'll pick it up and have a look at it. It might be a photograph. We've had pieces of music. We've had textiles. We've had food. So they will have a look at these and tell us some story. And sometimes the story that they tell is almost verbatim. Sometimes they tell the same story, but they embellish it. They enhance. So they're recalling what they've told us, and then they'll bring in another story, or they'll just add some more detail. Sometimes they'll tell the same story, but in not the same kind of animation and detail. Sometimes they have no recall whatsoever. They'll pick up a token and say, oh, well, this is a such and such, and nothing further. Sometimes they'll tell a different story that may be related, or it may be an entirely new story. And sometimes they'll start talking about something else related to the token, and after a little while they come back and tell the same story, either verbatim with more detail or less detail. So that has tended to be the kinds of patterns that we've seen so far, although we're not finished yet, so there may be other patterns as well. So in doing this study, of course, there were several pieces that I was trying to reconcile or contextualize in some way. So we have individuals with early stage dementia where there is some initial loss of cognitive function. Sometimes it's very hard to actually tell, although at some point something characteristic may happen. Someone may tell a story more than once, for example, or they may have some difficulty finding words or names. Sometimes they'll say something about an event and struggle with the time of the event. So it's not that someone comes in wearing a name tag that says, I have early stage Alzheimer's disease. These are individuals who have registered with the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto and have self-selected to participate in some kind of a program and the programs are geared to those with early stage Alzheimer's dementia. But it is very, very subtle, and everyone manifests it in a different way. So often, the common perception of Alzheimer's is that you forget things, you forget names, you forget people, and so on. Well, you may, but there may be other things that happen, and so there's no one-size-fits-all. So when I was first conceiving of this study, I was thinking of it more in terms of something to do with classification or categorization. You know, in doing this study, would we in fact see some sort of a pattern for how people looked at the tokens and sort of put them together and sifted through them, sorted them, clumped them, associated them in some way? And this journey that I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about is the journey of how we kept running up against the same question. Here we're talking to these people, you know, fascinating engagement. The interviews and the stories were really engaging and so on. But so what? So we had stories. What did this mean? And you know, how could I actually stand up in front of a group of IORG people and say something about what that might possibly mean to us in terms of knowledge organization or information organization, or even what happens at some kind of an academic framing, within an academic framing. So we were looking at this and saying, well, you know, does this study have something to do with the way that people make sense of things from the perspective of sorting, sifting, clumping, putting together, linking, and so on. So we were looking within the literature of knowledge organization. We looked at things like, you know, with the literature around facets, some of Ranganathan's work on colon classification. Would any of those help give us some clues to where we were going with this? And although there were some very promising moments, it basically seemed a kind of a dead end for us. So we weren't sure we could say very much about that, because these stories were quite free-flowing. We weren't entirely sure what kind of a linkage we could make to the token. So, you know, nice idea, but back to the drawing board. Well, certainly we could contextualize the study within this aspect of information behaviors, some of Durban's SenseMaking and recall. That seemed somewhat promising, but again, there was something missing. You know, if there is a gap in knowledge, and how you go about addressing that gap seems to say that you are seeking something, a piece of information. But we were not actually asking people to seek a memory. We were asking them simply to tell us stories, and then to have a look at some of these tokens or memory cues and tell us some more stories. So we might argue that they were looking for a kind of information, if you will, in terms of whatever would help to relive, retell that memory. But so it was, you know, kind of getting warmer, but not really where we needed and felt we wanted to be. So because we were dealing with stories, we said, well, maybe we should be looking at the literature dealing with narratives. And it's a huge literature, as you will all know, huge literature. I'll give you an address for our wiki at the end, and you're welcome if you wish to join it. We can certainly give you an invitation and you can have a look. But the literature that we've compiled around the whole issue of narrative inquiry and narrative analysis is quite detailed. So we said, well, yes, stories, a narrative in terms of, we could be looking at the structure of the stories. You know, could we compare the stories across the follow-up? So the first story, we would look at that in terms of its structure. What were the different stories in terms of the themes that they were saying, the way that they sequenced their discourse, the way that they looked at time, place, person, and event. Could we also look at their particular point of view and how they generated perhaps different story plots? So that was some of Bruner's work we were looking at as a possible way of doing a comparative analysis across the initial interview, where there's the narration of the personal story, and then the follow-up using the tokens the first time through, and then the second time through. So it was kind of interesting. We were exploring that a little bit. We actually pulled off some, there are many sites on the web, as you might know, of memory sites where people tell stories about events living through the Blitz in the Second World War, or there are stories of some Holocaust survivors, for example. Anyway, there are a number of different sites where you can go and listen to stories. So we tried this out to see if maybe that might have some promise and bear some fruit. Again, sort of like information, behavior, sense-making, recall, some interesting aspects, but not quite there. We also looked at some of the concepts around the stories themselves. When we tell a story, as I'm sure all of you will know and have experienced, you may tell the same story very differently to different people. And there are things that may be built into that in terms of your own self-awareness, how you want to present yourself to others, the role you take in the story. Maybe in the story that you tell one person, you're kind of the interested bystander, and in the story you tell someone else that you really want to impress, you are the hero or the heroine, you do something amazing and heroic that you just observe the first time through. But I'm sure no one in this room has done anything like that. Conway refers to this as the remembering imagining system. So depending on the receiver of our story and the kind of self-image we want to portray, our stories may vary. And of course our stories may vary based on social norms. If I'm telling a story in a context with some of my best friends who may look upon me as being somewhat of a clown, it may be a very highly embellished story, but if I were in a crowd where I didn't know people, it might be a much more subdued story. But you get the idea. So we thought we could look at some of the structural aspects, or we could look at their stories from within the autobiographical models in terms of what might they have included one time, excluded another, what kind of sense of self are they portraying. Again, interesting, we've continued to move on. There was just something that we couldn't quite put we didn't have the aha moment, the eureka moment yet. So many of those other things we were looking at, just to go back here, the stories themselves are related to the individual, and so that's the individual telling the stories. This whole series here is more to do with the tokens or the memory cues, how materiality, the objects themselves, whether they were material in a digital sense or a physical sense, what role they would play. So we looked at some of the literature around reminiscence therapy, which is used by activationists working with those with Alzheimer's dementia, also used in cognitive therapies where you ask people to tell life stories, and it's just an opportunity for them to, for those who are, may have some sort of a brain injury or some kind of a cognitive impairment, it gives them an opportunity to re-engage with memories and come to terms with them. Memory boxes, I'm not sure if any of you have dealt with a family member or a friend who is in a long-term residence, many long-term residences, and particularly those who particularly engage with those with Alzheimer's dementia, encourage memory boxes. So people choose objects or tokens, things that are important to them in their lives, and they actually have a display case. And in the case of Alzheimer's dementia, the memory boxes are there as a kind of a talking point and a way of helping people to continue to engage with some aspect of their life. There's a similar sort of thing with storyboards, asking people to tell stories. This is often used with people who've had strokes or brain injuries, and then the storyboards are put together with photographs and words and sounds and so on. to, again, help to relive memory. So all of these are surrogates for something, people, places, events, things in a material sense. Chaudhry has, who actually works at the University of British Columbia in a program that specializes in dementia and related diseases. He's done a piece of research that he called The Journey Back Home, where he would give individuals with dementia photographs of the family home and ask them to talk about it. Those tended to be very directed interviews, so as someone would say something, there was a whole series of questions that they asked that were actually scripted, so a little bit fixed, if you might see that in a fixity kind of way. There are also commercial products such as Memory Lane, where you would give a profile of someone. They were in their 20s during the war years, and Memory Lane would put together some photographs and music and so on that would represent that time period to stimulate memories. We looked at the work of, we just call him Mr. C, or Dr. C rather, or sometimes we say CNRH for perhaps obvious reasons, and apologies to anyone here for whom this rolls off the tongue. Wrote quite a wonderful book, The Meaning of Things, and the idea that objects can be an extension of self. So, was this research focusing on the tokens? Was it focusing on the stories? Was it focusing on the individuals? We sort of have a little bit of all of these things here. One of the things that happens with some of the assistive devices, and in some of the research that relates to technologies, is one of the things we grappled with. There was the idea that you actually work with someone to reproduce their story and to, in a sense, capture that story, solidify that story, or we call it fixing the story in a fixedness kind of way, or fixity was another word we used. There's a research done, SenseCam, where you actually wear a camera, and it's a virtual reality camera, and you walk around during the day and you do whatever you do, and then later on you can replay it, see what you did, where you went, who you met, and so on. It's a way of having a recall when your own memory may fail you. And it's also a way that you can communicate with family and friends and say, what did you do today? Well, let me show you. But it's whatever happened, and it's fixed, and there's nothing extraneous to that. And Ron Becker, who actually is at the Center for Aging at the University of Toronto, he's a computer science HCI specialist, and he worked with 12 families putting together videos. So the actual individuals with Alzheimer's would tell a story, the family members would add things to it. They would bring photographs and music and videos and so on, and they actually put together for each individual a video, a kind of life video. And well, it's a very compelling story, and very moving in the way, no pun intended, very moving in the way that it was put together, in the interaction of the family and the individual with Alzheimer's disease. What we thought was kind of fixed, that person can replay it over and over and over, but it's the same slice of their life. So that's not a criticism, but we were trying to figure out, is memory really that fixed? Especially when you look within the narrative context, where memory can be, your life story can change across time. Which of course then raised the issue of truthfulness, or I guess in the Colbert sense, truthiness, because we are dealing with individuals whom we don't know personally, who have early stage Alzheimer's disease, and they're telling us stories. And first of all, it's none of our business to find out if these stories are true. And secondly, does it really matter? They're simply telling us a story. which we take at face value, because we're not there to measure the accuracy of the memory, the content. Does the memory, can we measure a change from the first time through to the third time when we're dealing with them? That's a much more accurate memory than the first time around. That's not what we're doing. We're not doing any clinical measures, and we really grappled with this idea of, should they be true? In the sense of Becker's study, they were true stories because they were contextualized along with, not necessarily by, but along with the engagement of family and friends. So in a sense, it was a quote-unquote true representation. But we have no idea whether what the stories we hear are in fact true representations. They're simply stories, and we take them at face value. So we struggled a lot with that and said, well, okay, where are we now? At the ACES conference, we did a poster, and a couple of the folks who stopped by asked very constructively if we had in fact looked at some of the literature around embodiment of story, which led us down the path of some of the performative aspects of memory, which to some degree relates to what we were looking at earlier with narrative. But what is this performance of the self? We're, perhaps only when we're alone with ourselves in a nice quiet spot are we truly ourselves. When we're with others, we are in a performance state. And it's true for the participants with whom we're working, that these are individuals who are performing their life story for us in some way. And we don't know whether it is really their life story or a story that is just a story. But nonetheless, it is a performance of sorts. So Golander and Rez talk about some work that they've done dealing with individuals with mental health issues, schizophrenia, autism, depression, and bipolar disease. And this does extend as well to other cognitive issues. So they see the disease or the self as performed by the individual. So someone who is in perhaps in a manic phase with bipolar disorder, that's a self that's being performed within that particular stage or phase. Doesn't mean that individual is any more or less or different from who he or she is. They posit that it's just the same self in this performative sense. And our own Marcia Bates has been doing some interesting work. This is a little bit out of context, but where she talks about the self as being more than memory. There's a continuum of memory and creativity that exists in a social context. So again, a memory is maybe of the self, but it's relative to where we are, with whom we are engaging, to whom we are telling our stories. So we had arrived here somewhere, around the end of last year. Then at the I conference in the beginning of February, Erica was talking with Annette Goldsmith, some of you may know, and she actually does work with in children's literature, children's services. But somehow they got talking about storytelling. That's what they were talking about, storytelling. And Annette said, well, have you seen the work of Ann Bastings? And she's at the University of Milwaukee, the Center on Aging and Community. And she's come up with something that she calls time slips. And this is sort of this performative aspect, the embodiment of the self in the moment, where individuals are telling stories. These are individuals who have dementia, and they get together within their residences with facilitators, and they tell stories. And if I can just do this. Let's see if we can. This is the time slips site that Professor Bastings has done. She's in the theater department. So it's a great discipline to work in. We get to go across all disciplines. The information discipline has lots to do with theater, very clearly. So just to give you a little bit of context here, this is one of, there are many, many clips that you can have a look at. There was one clip where they show residents being shown that picture, and then they said, "Who is this person?" And this woman, Karen, said, "Her name might be Gloria Jean. She looks happy." There's the beginning of the story. So, time slips, open storytelling to everyone. We're replacing the pressure to remember with the freedom to imagine. This was our aha moment around that truthiness piece. We said, well, what does it matter? The point is that individuals are going to engage in telling us stories. And it doesn't matter whether they're true or not. They're stories. And we're looking at how the tokens themselves stimulate these stories. So this is just a very, very, I think this is a 1.5 minute clip, so let's see if we can get this to go.
Time slips is
Time slips.
Time slips is
Time slips is joy. Time slips is happiness, love, freedom.
time slips is star making. It makes stars out of people.
Time slips is an opportunity to let your imagination soar.
everybody contributes to the process, and it's a creative process. No wrong answers. You can say whatever you want.
It makes you feel like you can just fly anywhere, go anywhere you want to with this, and you feel good about it, and happy and pleased. It unleashes the imagination, you know. I thought when you lost it, Mom, I have to tell you I'm pregnant. How? That's what I like anyway.
You feel people laughing, you can feel their spirits lifting. It almost feels like the sun's coming in the room when it could be a very cloudy day.
So the open poetic language of improvisational storytelling invites people with dementia to express themselves and to connect with others. So that was kind of our aha moment, and who knew that it would be right under, well, not exactly under our feet, but right here on the campus of UW Milwaukee. So that led to this idea. We were trying to say, how do we contextualize this within an information framework? Is it information categorization or sifting, sorting, connecting, associating? Is it something to do with the way people seek information? Is it something to do with the way that people construct information in terms of a narrative? Is it something to do with the way that they portray themselves? Is it something we can capture within small packets of fixity? And what we came to, and this is still to be fleshed out a little bit more and a little bit more scaffolding around, is what we said, well, you know, maybe what this research is doing is, within the information context, is kind of positioning a shift from sense-making to memory-making. There's a great body of literature around information seeking, information behaviors. What we're looking at is how someone seeks a memory. So, you know, actually this is the absolute worst question to ask somebody with Alzheimer's. Don't you remember when? Because if they remembered when, they would tell you. But without that kind of pressure, you know, for someone to be presented with an object to seek some kind of something, and it might be a memory, Or it might simply be a story that engages. They're not seeking information, but they're engaging with something in their memory. Construction of meaning within the information science sense to a construction or a reconstruction of memory. They might, in fact, when they tell us the same story almost verbatim, be reconstructing a memory, or they may be constructing a new memory or a memory that is enhanced or that leads to other things, and so on. And you may have seen in that video, there are longer videos that give you a much better sense of what it's all about. But you will see people who are sitting essentially like this, looking down and very much insular. And as people start telling pieces of the story and they engage, their physical body changes, their facial, their whole face lights up and changes. They start laughing, they're engaging. Their point of commonality is the story. Their point of commonality is not what they did, where they lived, who their friends are, whether or not they have family. Nothing to do with them necessarily, but it is them. It is them engaging. So it's quite a remarkable transformation to see. The sense-making that we speak about in a Durban sense, or within the information studies arena, we're talking about perhaps memory-making de novo. These are emergent narratives. These are the time slips narratives. These are the things that really energize and give a certain kind of life and meaning to individuals. Once a week, I think they do it for an hour a week. And incidentally, the time slips, they have workshops for people who want to engage in that activity to facilitate, and they'll be having a workshop in June. Just by the by. So just to go back to the research questions then, to revisit them, we went back to them and said, well, you know, in what way do they use them? We're not exactly sure. I'm not sure whether we will be able to answer that question, but obviously something is happening because they look at them and then they respond to them. Again, I'm not sure we'll be able to answer this question exactly, but we do know that sometimes the memories are indeed recalled, and in many cases embellished, enhanced, and in many cases they generate new kinds of stories. And this we are going to look at. We've got the narratives, and we're going to do some comparisons, look at structure, look at the way people present themselves, all those pieces of narratives that I talked about. So we should be able to come up with some sort of sense of that as the research continues over the summer. So we were searching for the so what. How do we contextualize this? What does this mean? And I kept saying, well, we're in the information discipline. So what? What does this mean to us? So I have some tentative thoughts on this. And there's a couple of them that are very concrete. So if we're working in libraries, archives, community museums, this may be an opportunity for us, and for those of you here, for the students that you teach, to think in terms of, we've got these vast repositories of digital, physical information, objects, items, and so on. We, in fact, could look at putting together, I put it in quotes, memory boxes, customized, continuous, digital and or physical tokens. So somebody, their profile, the kinds of things that are important in their stories, you keep changing it up. So there's not the fixity, but there is the challenge of refreshed tokens to engage with the same memory recall with different stories and so on. So that's a possibility. For those of us in the information organization arena, looking at packets of information in a different way. Not as in satisfying an information need, but perhaps as in addressing a memory need. Just a different way of looking at it. And for the individuals with Alzheimer's dementia, the fact that, now, I'm very grateful to say that I have not experienced it. It's not like, you know, you can get the flu and get over it. But what I imagine is that increasingly you lose yourself. You become less connected with the world around you. We might think of this, for example, in terms of maybe, you know, as technologies advance and new media, there might be something you're not quite au courant with, and you're thinking, I'm a little out of the loop here. There's sort of a slight anxiety that you're not quite in step with everyone else. And that's how I imagine, without oversimplifying, that it might be for someone with Alzheimer's disease, that they begin to lose themselves and that connectedness. So for one thing, maybe you have the opportunity to, in fact, connect with your memories. And in that case, as with the Becker study, it can give you a point of commonality for connecting with your family and others. And of course, family and friends also notice the loss that's occurring. They see someone disappearing from them. And that can, of course, be very anxiety-producing, very tragic, very sad. So it can give a point to rally around a particular memory or stories. The other thing is, and this is actually spoken to in a longer time slips video, that the individuals who come regularly to those sessions, they're at least once a week engaging in very energetic, creative storytelling. And that, you know, like any of us, you get a good idea, you get to talk to people, it's fun, you're laughing, people are paying attention to you, you're paying attention to others, you're making connections, you feel really great. It's a certain quality of life. And like anything, it's like our brains, like our bodies, you exercise your bodies, this is a good thing. It's also true for brain health. So to the extent that we get people engaging with stories, connecting with their memories, going through that schematic, in a sense, that I showed at the very beginning, this too is a kind of brain exercise. And you know, in an ideal sense, it would be great to know that in some small way we would be contributing to the quality of life and the continued independence of individuals for whom the future may not look particularly bright. So that's what I have for you, and I'd love some comments or questions. And this is a dreadful thing to reproduce, so I can leave the slides here for her lead. This is our wiki, and you're welcome to come and join us if you wish. So, you could tell me a story too. If you don't have a question.
I have a question. I'm not sure